Okay, so we're talking about the idea of growing more firmly established, and that's kind of the theme for the month of September. So that's, I believe it's already September. I don't know how that happened, but and we're going to look at seeking heavenly wisdom to sustain us. And there's, of course, a lot of that in these passages. And the overview is of all this. If you put it all together, the main idea of all these chapters is that punishment comes from violating God's commands. The punishment that comes can be extremely brutal, but His mercy will still be seen by those who love Him. And there's great ironies here that we see in the prophets and the minor prophets. And just as a technical matter, and I'm sure we all know, but other people may not, the Bible is not all, the Old Testament is not all in chronological order, right? We have the Psalms, for example, before Jeremiah. Jeremiah was long after David, but David wrote most of the Psalms. It's organized according to different kinds of literature, and we have in the back, beyond Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, we start with Isaiah, the major prophets, and then we have the minor prophets after that end up ending the Old Testament. And the major difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets has to do with the length of the book. It has nothing to do with the importance of the prophet. So I just wanted to throw that out as we look through this. But Jeremiah chapters 48 through 52 has more about God's punishment that's being promised. Really, this is extending to Moab and many other nations that were in that area. These are small kingdoms that God is going to punish. And you remember, He's going to do this through the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, who He's sending as His servant, He calls him, and going to punish the nations of the world. And primarily, the punishment was coming because of polytheism. That is, they were worshiping other gods. And so this punishment, this is the highest rebellion against God, is that they would create something out of stone or wood and bow down to it and worship it as if it were the creator of all things. And there are many other morally impure things that He's going to punish them for, and most of those, or many of those that are listed, are related to the worship of these other gods. So they all tie hand in hand together. God has always been concerned with morality. And you don't have to worship a false god to have bad morals, but they do generally go hand in hand. If you're worshiping false gods, you're going to have bad morals because you've lost your center, right? You've lost what makes things right. So chapters 48 through the end of the book, through 52, we have proclamations against Moab and many other nations, and chapters 50 and 51, we have proclamations against Babylon. So last week we mentioned the book of Habakkuk, God talked in there about the fact that He would use Babylon to punish Israel, and then He's going to punish Babylon for their sins against Israel. And it wasn't a sin for them to punish the Israelites. It wasn't a sin for them to do what God wanted them to do, but they went above and beyond what God said, and they did a lot of atrocious things. And morally speaking, they were not doing what was right. And so there was punishment that's going to come on to them as well, and not just against Israel, but many other nations that they mistreated, and pride and arrogance, all kinds of things relate to that. And you can see the book of Daniel and see where Nebuchadnezzar is addressed because of his pride, right? And I believe it's around chapter 5. I have to go back and look, but where he was humiliated and caused to be like an animal for it said 7 times, 7 periods of time. We don't know what that means. It could have been 7 years. It doesn't say. But for however length of time, he was basically acting like an animal, on his hands and knees, eating grass, and everything. His hair grew out really long, and his nails grew out really long. Didn't take care of himself. He was a madman. And then when he finally recognized that God was the one who was in control, God healed him of that and put him back in the place where he was on his throne. And there are, as we discussed that before, there's actually indications in history of something that happened to Nebuchadnezzar where he was gone for a period of time, out of pocket, and they never explained why. But when he came back, they let him just resume power, which is very, very odd when you're talking about succession of kings and things like this, that God made sure that happened that way. And then chapter 52 is kind of an appendix. It's the fall of Jerusalem. There's exile that's talked about. There's a little hope that's shown with the release of Jehoiachin in captivity, and he was actually treated with dignity by one of the kings after Nebuchadnezzar. He was released from prison and was even allowed to eat at the king's table for the rest of his life. So there's a little bit of hope that's there. Then we have the book of Lamentations, which is exactly what it sounds like. These are 5 lamentations. These are 5 funeral dirges, really, is what they are. They're very depressing, and it's all about Jerusalem and the destruction that's coming from Babylon. I don't know if it was written beforehand or after the fact. It doesn't really matter. It covers the things that happened to Jerusalem and to the people of Judah, and also to Jeremiah, which we're going to talk about. That's what the focus of our class is going to be, is this book. And it's an incredibly beautiful book. In spite of the sorrow that's caused through the reading of it, it is incredibly beautiful in the way it's laid out. And I'll explain Hebrew parallelism and how it all works together in the later part of this class this morning. And then we have Ezekiel chapters 1 through 7. We have the vision of God's glory in chapter 1 and Ezekiel's call in chapters 2 and 3. Which also still deals with the vision of God's glory as well. Then we have object lessons depicting Jerusalem's coming destruction. Remember, he was told to get a clay tablet and draw on it a picture of the city, and he was supposed to set up siege engines and all kinds of things. And this was to illustrate, I guess that was the first PowerPoint presentation. I don't know, but it was to illustrate the coming destruction and to help reinforce in their minds, this is going to happen. I want you to look at what it's going to look like. So he was doing that, and that's Ezekiel. And then chapter 6, we have judgments that were pronounced against idolatry, which was extremely common in the time of the destruction of this writing. The reason, of course, that the Israelites or the Judeans were taken into captivity was mainly because of this. And Ezekiel is writing after the first wave came in and took people out of the city. They took Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and other important people. There's a second wave that came that took other people out, and he evidently was part of this. And he is writing from a river called Shibar in the Babylonian area and the Mesopotamian area. And that's where he is. And he's writing by this river. And this was, I had it in my notes, and I didn't get it into these notes. It was written sometime after the first, I think it's 7 years before the final destruction of Jerusalem, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed everything. And so he's right there in that swing period, and there are still people claiming that there wasn't anything bad going to happen anymore, that Babylon wasn't going to come back, they weren't going to go into captivity. There's all kinds of claims being made, and he's writing to remind Israel or remind Judah, this is why you're going into captivity. It's not going to get any better, it's going to get worse. And also to encourage the people that were already in exile to maintain their focus and not give up God, even though they're being punished. And so there's a lot of that kind of going on. And chapter 7 is the final judgment of Israel, and that's the end of this reading. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to say about of Israel and Judah combined. Oh, it says it right here in my notes. This was written 6 years before the final destruction of Jerusalem. So those are the overview, very brief overview of these chapters. Did anyone have any comments or questions about any of the reading that we did that we can discuss in class? Yes. Oh, it's simply the size of the books. Yeah, that's the only way that they've made a distinction between them. And Lamentations is from the book of Jeremiah. I mean, from the Jeremiah is the author, and Daniel ends what they call the major prophets. So it would be Isaiah through Daniel, and there's 12 chapters in Daniel, and then it gets into Hosea and Joel and Amos and the rest of these books. And most of these smaller books are, I mean, they're just a few chapters. Amos is a little bit longer. I'm looking here. There's 9 chapters in Amos, and so there are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, they're called the minor prophets because of where they are, because of their size. Zechariah was 14 chapters, but these are simply designations that other people have made, and the Bible doesn't declare one to be major and one to be minor. Humans have done that, and there's nothing wrong with the idea. There's just, this is how we've grouped them, and it's a historical thing that's been done over a long period of time, and it doesn't have to be grouped this way. You know, if you open your Bible and you got a Bible one day and it had it in chronological order, we might have a little bit of a quandary. We might think, well, this is not the right order. But if we put it in a different order, it's still the same book, right? It's still the same information. And we're reading it chronologically, so we have it we're reading it in a different order than it's actually written. Anyway, it's a good question. Anybody have thoughts or questions about the passages? Yeah. Yeah, you do.
The professor who taught me American history, I had her for both semester, and she had a photographic memory and totally recall. But her comment concerning history, she said, history is not just a study about names, dates, places, okay, and dead people. She said it's a study of the interaction of people.
Yeah.
All the names, dates, and places of people, if they keep everything in chronological order.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, since we're talking about this, the Bible, I mean, the Old Testament is definitely laid out in a logical way. It's just different. So the first, from Genesis all the way to Esther, to the book of Esther, are all basically chronological. And then after that, it's almost like they say, oh, here's this other stuff we've got, right? We have the history, but there's a lot of truth to this. These things are, especially like the book of Psalms and Proverbs, they're written in ways you really wouldn't know exactly where to put it between the books. So instead of trying to squeeze it in the books, they put it at the end. So the Old Testament really, in a sense, is only Genesis through Esther. And then they say, here are other things. These are all inspired by God still, but it didn't fit as nice and tidy in the places, so they stuck them after that. We have the wisdom literature that was divided up in five books there, and that was Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And then after that, we have the prophets. So that's how it's divided up, and the prophets can be scattered throughout, especially the book of 1 Samuel through 2 Chronicles. They're all mixed in there. So instead of trying to fit them all in, they just put them at the end of the reading, and it's kind of a appendix kind of thing.
Okay.
All right.
You know, you mentioned Job in those books, but you and I, you know, we've seen an awful lot of evidence suggest that Job is probably one of the most ancient pieces of writing that we have.
Yeah.
Okay, it was probably written within a couple hundred years after.
That's what I think, yeah. And it's nobody knows exactly the date of its writing for Job, but there's some good evidence it was written long before Moses lived. So anyway, it's interesting. Just read through that. All right, so let's talk about then the book of Lamentations. And kind of to preface this, I wanted to talk about, again, a reminder of Hebrew poetry. And remember, Hebrew poetry, in English, we try to do poetry by, it feels right to us to have the lines, what's the word I'm looking for? Rhyme. right? So we're rhyming. Sometimes it's every other line that rhymes. We have different patterns of doing this. And sometimes they don't rhyme at all, which drives me crazy because you can't really call it poetry if it doesn't rhyme in my thinking. But that's my personal preference because I realize there's other ways to do it. But the Hebrews didn't rhyme words; they rhymed ideas. And if you think of it that way, it makes it a little bit easier to understand their thinking. And they would take a sentence, and they most of the time it's called Hebrew parallelism, and most of the time there's two parallel statements, and one will either support the other or they'll contradict the other. So you'll have contrasting ideas or synonymous ideas. And that's important when you're reading through the scriptures to recognize, especially when you're reading the poetry, because if we say two different things, we might think, oh, we're making a list, but they weren't necessarily making a list. They were making comparisons. And that's an important idea as you read through. In my Bible, it's obvious what portions are considered to be poetry, and just because of the way they format the text. And you can read the front of your Bible, it'll tell you a difference. For example, in normal text, with mine, it takes up the whole column, but in poetry, it's usually center space, so it's in the center of the column. But that's neither here nor there. It shows that they recognize a difference. And why is it important that we recognize, this is not really the point, but why is it important that we recognize the type of literature that it is? Yeah, you have to interpret text based upon the type of language that it is employed. You can't go to apocalyptic language and treat it like you would treat the book of Romans. They're not the same in how they're interpreted. And it's something that we do automatically, but we recognize that there are differences. We have to recognize that there are differences. So you would interpret the book of Proverbs differently even than the book of Genesis, for example. So anyway, with Hebrew parallelism, this is an interesting thing because there's different kinds. There's one called synthetic parallelism that is it's a series of lists. It's really kind of a list. And the intent is not necessarily to provide everything that's possible in a list, but it's to provide ideas that will give you a general idea of what he's trying to say. And it usually builds up from the beginning. It builds up and makes a case along the way and gives you points to a general conclusion at the end that's even a bigger idea. So it can kind of build on that. And we also have the idea of ellipsis. And does anyone know what an ellipsis is in writing? You know. Can you tell me? You forgot?
Yeah, I can't remember.
It's kind of in a circle, and it's almost like parenthetical. Often an ellipsis is, I guess there's two different kinds, but unless I'm thinking of another word that I'm not using. An ellipsis is something that often will leave information out that's kind of implied. And so it will tell you, for example, we might do this if we're texting someone, we're sending them a message, and we say some words and we put ... That's an ellipsis. That means that there's more here, and I want you to just fill in the blank here. And usually if we do that, we can. And the context will tell you enough about what you're trying to say, right? So, for example, I can send you a text. I'm really hungry. I'm going to potluck, and guess what I'm doing? ... What am I going to be doing? I'm going to be eating. That's pretty obvious, right, from the context. So that's part of what an ellipsis is. It leaves out information that's implied that we have to supply, but it's still there. The Bible does that. I'm not prepared to tell you how often, or if I've never done a detailed study of this. In a sense, it does this in the English translations because if you're reading through in the New Testament, for example, you're going to be reading and you'll see a word that, or even sometimes a series of words that are italicized. And I used to think that when you're looking at an italicized word, those are words that are emphasized in the text. But actually what that's saying is those things are not in the text at all. And so you have to supply those words in order to understand it. So let's just look really quick at an example that might help. I don't know of any. I'm just going to look through here and see. Let's see. Some of it is just grammatical. Some of it is important. I should have probably looked through this before I tried to do this. Oh, here a minute. Let me find this passage. I just thought of one. Okay, now this actually isn't shown as an ellipsis, but in John 8:58, no, I'm sorry, that's not the right passage. Well, it is in some passages. John 8:58, in some translations, it says, I am he. No, it doesn't say I am he. All right, let's look at another passage. This is actually kind of a funny one. In 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 3 is talking to women. And it literally says, do not let your adornment be outward. Don't put on clothes outwardly, is what it says. Well, if you take it at face value, there's an ellipsis there. If you're taking it at face value, that says women are not supposed to put clothes on. Literally is what it says. But in my translation, it supplies a word merely. Now, what does the word merely do to that passage? It says women are not to, do not let your adornment be merely outward. How does that change the passage?
You need to be wearing a lot more than just clothes.
Yes. Don't worry about just your clothing. It's not saying don't wear clothes, but literally it's saying don't wear clothes. And so the Hebrew or the Greek mind would put in there automatically they meant only clothes, right? Don't worry about only wearing clothes. And his point here is the rest of the verse, arranging hair and wearing gold or putting on fine apparel, rather let it be the hidden person of the heart. So there's a contrast or comparison there, contrast. Don't worry about the self, worry about the inside, right? So that's an example of this. There's also a way of looking at this that you would say are parallel ideas with other ideas in between. So Paul is notorious for this. You read through the book of Romans or Galatians or wherever, and he'll be talking about Jesus, and then it's almost like he changes the subject. He starts talking about something else altogether differently, and so we put it in parentheses. And if you look at that, the book of Acts does that. In fact, the book of Acts does that in a large scale. It skips. It includes several chapters between two ideas. And what you have to do to get the flow of the context is really skip those chapters and pick up later on to pick up where you're trying to say, because these are kind of an inclusion that separates two ideas. And it's just historical. That's how way people do it. We do this kind of thing all the time. Well, the book of Lamentations does that kind of thing. And that's the whole reason I'm talking about all this. I'm trying to give you a framework so you can understand this book a little bit better. In chapters 1, and there's 5 chapters, these are all 5 different hymns or dirges, funeral songs, that were written by Jeremiah. And they all relate to the destruction of Israel, or destruction of Jerusalem. And they are in Hebrew parallelism, of course, but not only they have a lot of parallel ideas, they actually have the songs themselves are parallel ideas. And another interesting factor about this is fascinating to me. It may not be to you, but it was written in a way so that if you notice in the book of Lamentations, every chapter, with the exception of chapter 3, is written with 22 verses. And there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Every verse starts with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It doesn't do that perfectly, especially in chapter 5, but it does. It's overwhelmingly, it is the order of the Hebrew alphabet, which was not completely uncommon, but it is uncommon to see it at this scale. Psalm 119 does the same thing. But this shows, it's kind of like saying it's A to Z in suffering. All 5 of these things do that. The book of chapter 3 is 66 verses, and that is the Hebrew alphabet 3 times, which is significant. It could have been divided up into 3 chapters, but it was one song, so they stuck it all in there. And that's even divided up into 2 sections, 3 sections actually, roughly 1 to 22, 23 to 44, and then 45 to 66. Those are the basic division of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's not a slave to that formula, but it does keep it for the most part. So this is the construction of the book. And in chapter 1, you have a parallel passage with chapter 5. And so if you read 1 and 5 together, they're different, but they are emphasizing the same thing. The emphasis of those 2 chapters is the personification of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is shown to be a woman who is crying out in agony because of all the things that had happened to her. And there's a list of things that she's had to endure. And of course, it also goes into why she had to endure these things, which is because of the sins of the people. In chapters 2 and 4, those are parallel things, and these are not perfect, but they do generally talk about these. 2 and 4 are talking about the people and their cry, the things that are happening to them as individuals and the problems that they're facing, and of course, the reasons for those things. And actually, in chapter 4, it gets a little bit more into the implications in the future beyond that. And then chapter 3 is divided into 3 sections, and the 2 outer sections are parallel ideas to each other, which is another fascinating idea, and that is the mistreatments from Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah's mourning, and how he was mistreated by the people who were in Jerusalem, and also how he's being mistreated because of the facts of the coming invasion of Babylon, or by the invasion of Babylon, if it already happened. And the justice that he demanded, and also the sorrow that he felt because it was going to happen to his people. And so all those things are in there, in those 2 parallel. And right in the middle, we have something that is actually, if you took it from its context and just read it by itself, you would not have any idea that it's part of a funeral dirge. And that is the trust that that Jeremiah has in God and His mercy. It stands out. It's like an Easter egg. It stands out as something that should not fit there, but it's logically, but it fits, and it's a perfect representation of really the major, not just the theme of Jeremiah and Lamentations, but the theme of all the prophets. That is, we have a God who, even though we're being punished and destroyed because of all the sins of the people, there is still mercy that God has. He's still a good God, and He's still one who should be praised and glorified. Which, if you take that out of its place and don't have anything like that in there, all you get is we serve a God who is mean and who is vindictive and who is harmful, and of course just, but there's no grace and mercy. And that's why these are so important to keep in context. So just to put it in a little bit different perspective, Dawkins, can't remember his first name, atheist of our times, who's probably written, Richard Dawkins, yes, thank you, who's probably written more books on atheism than I would ever care to read, but he is definitely seen as a major player against Christianity, if we put it that way. And he's written, I think one of them is called The God Delusion. He has said some horrible, horrific things about God and His nature. And most of that is, like I said before, if you took chapter 3 out of Lamentations and just read chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5, that's kind of the idea you might get, that he's just looking for opportunity to kill people. All kinds of things that he accused God of doing and saying. And there's no recognition that there's anything good in the qualities of God. So what do we already know about the reason that he defends atheism? We know that he's doing it because he sees a God who he can't justify in his mind. And if that's the view that you have of God, of course you wouldn't want to justify that. You want to support a God who is vindictive and uncaring and unjust ultimately, or do you want to support believe in a God who is also caring and merciful? Well, obviously, not because it's one we choose, but because this is his nature, and so we should see that. And if you're going to have a God who is eternal in all of his attributes, you have to recognize all of his attributes and not just cherry pick the ones that we don't like, right? So it's kind of like I mentioned before, there's a man I ran into, he said he didn't believe in God. I said, well, why don't you believe in God? He said, because he let my grandma die. That was his reason. I'm like, that's not a good reason. He said, I just think he's mean. So I just decided not to believe in him. Like, is that really going to change it? If he's actually real, is it going to change anything if you suddenly decide, okay, I just don't believe him anymore? He's not like the tooth fairy, or, he's not dependent upon your belief in him to exist. So you choose to adapt yourself and understand God better, or you choose to rebel against God. But either way, that told me he believed in God. He just didn't want to believe in God, so he decided not to. And that's a little bit different. Anyway, so this is a very important book. In chapter 1, I already talked about these different things. You have it in the notes here of what we're doing. I want to look at in chapter 3 and get a little bit more of a taste of what's going on. Let's look in chapter 3, verses 22 through 42. It says, through God's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I hope in him. And I hope that you'll go back, if you haven't done it, go back and read the entire book. The irony of him making these statements here is very, very big compared to the things he's already said. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and keep silent, because God has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him, and be full of reproach, for the Lord will not cast off forever. Though he causes grief, he will show compassion, according to the multitude of his mercies. For he does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. What does that tell us about those verses? What does that tell us about God and his allowing us to be punished, or even his punishment against us? What does it say about him? He has reason for it all, and it's not void of his compassion, right? Very good. In fact, if you look at 33, your translation may say something differently, but mine said he does not afflict willingly, or the footnote says from the heart. That's the idea. Well, did he willingly send Babylon to destroy these people? Yes. So what does that mean, he does not afflict willingly? There's purpose, yes. And it's not on a whim, and it's not what he wanted, right? That's certainly implied. So when God punishes, it's not because he wants to punish. It's not because he enjoys it. And any of us who have raised children, what would you say about your father if he punished you and he enjoyed doing it? It's not a good situation, right? I'm not saying that you can't, let me phrase this delicately, that there's not some measure of satisfaction in disciplining your children. There is. It should never be, they made me mad, I want to hurt them, and I'm going to be satisfied by hurting them. That's not my point. But there is some satisfaction in knowing that you're doing something that is good for that child, even though it's painful for that child. And so you can rest easy, even if your child will come back. And typically, sometimes children will, if they're trained right, they won't. But sometimes children will look at you and say, I hate you, or I can't believe you do these things to me. But what do we generally say to console ourselves? It's good that that happened. And wait till they have kids and they'll understand, right? Generally speaking. So we recognize that if children say those kinds of things, we don't take it to heart and start thinking, well, maybe, unless we did something wrong, but we don't start thinking, well, I'm just not going to punish them anymore. They don't like the punishment, so I'm just not going to do it anymore. What would you say about a parent that did that? Would you say that parent loved that child? No. That parent didn't love that child. That parent loved the way he felt that child made him feel. And so if that child is not making him feel happy anymore, he's going to stop punishing the child because it makes him feel bad that his child feels bad. And so he's going to stop. That's not love. That's selfishness. So love means that you're going to do what is best for someone else regardless of their response to it. And that's amazing to think about, that God would do that to us, and He has the courage and the wisdom to do it perfectly and not cause us harm, but cause us healing if we will respond appropriately and if we're trained by it, which is actually the point of the lesson this morning. And that's kind of the idea about seeking the heavenly wisdom when we're facing trials and temptations. Recognition that God is doing this for a reason, and that reason is not simply punishment. That reason has to do with our growth toward Him. And when we recognize that, it helps. He is seeing that. And so if you look at verse 37, he's bringing to mind the sovereignty of God. And God is not sovereign simply because He's all-powerful. Might does not make right. God is sovereign in all because of His eternal attributes. All of the attributes, not just His power. So he says here in verse 37, who is he who speaks and it comes to pass when the Lord has not commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that woe and well-being proceed? Why should a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? That's a great question, right? Here's another thought we can have with this. If someone is going to thank God for the blessings that they receive from God, they also need to recognize that they need to thank God for the discipline they receive from Him, because both of those are for our benefit. And to be unthankful for one means that we don't recognize what God is doing and who God is. And I'm not saying it's pleasant. I'm saying that we should be thankful that He would be willing to do that for us. And then in verse 40, he's calling them to the idea. He says, let's search out and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and hands to the God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled. You have not pardoned. There's a lot there. We have the compassion of God in verse 22. We have the hope they could have in His faithfulness in verses 23 through 25. 26 through 36, how to behave during the punishments that are going on. Don't speak out against God, and learn to appreciate what He is doing in us. And then reminders that God is in control, and we must turn back to Him. So we need to learn our lessons when we go through pain and trouble and struggles. And there's some lessons that when we learn, we don't have to have the lesson anymore. And there's some lessons that we're just going to keep getting because those are the ones that strengthen us and make us stronger for the next thing that we're going to. I'd like to think, I was talking to someone the other day, and I said, if I ever get a windfall every now and then, you get a little bit of extra money somehow, and you're thinking, oh, wow, how did this happen? And I would go and spend it all. But now the first thing that I do, and I look at Carla and I go, okay, what's about to happen? because I usually know something is coming that I need to prepare for, that God is helping me in advance to. And I was actually talking to a man yesterday. He had a great thing happen to him. He got a little extra money from doing some other work, and he said, I invested every bit of it in his house. And then, like 3 weeks later, all these things started happening that if he would have not done that, he would have had the money to fix it all. But that's the way things work, isn't it? We're trained and taught. But God does supply, and He helps us. We just don't always know what's coming. So we need to recognize God has a plan and try our best to figure out, what can I do to get the most out of this, the situation that we're in. All right, any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Jason, you're reading all the literature that we have in the Testament concerning final instructions, rules, and Matthew 5 and 6. And to me, it just reinforces, I guess, the comment that I've made to everybody that listened to me, especially since I came home from Saudi Arabia. But in the U.S. today, we have the minus military that's ever existed on the planet. Okay. But that's not where our strength as a nation. Our strength as a nation lies in love of God, fearing men and women who every day they go about their life doing the best that they know how, trying to please their Creator.
That's the only thing that's right. It's not the military.
All of these passages of Scripture, I mean, that just nails that home.
Yeah, definitely. We have to. It's righteousness that exalts a nation. It's not our military. And as important as that is, that's not what makes us great. So, all right. Well, thank you for your comments. We'll end class there.